Chapter 2.11 Multilevel Selection Theory for eusociality. This gaping hole in the theory of sociobiology or evolutionary psychology brings us to the present and the publication in 2012 of E.O. Wilson's The Social Conquest of Earth. Yes, once again, it was Wilson who concocted a solution to this problem of the offensiveness of evolutionary psychology's denigration of our moral instincts as selfish. Now, to the dismay of his earlier supporters, he has dismissed his previous evolutionary psychology theory as incorrect, inoperable, and as having failed, proffering in its place a new theory that not only contrives an explanation for our genuinely moral instincts, but takes the art of denial to the absolute extreme by contriving a non-human condition confronting explanation of the human condition itself. Known as multilevel selection or a new theory of eusociality, eusociality simply meaning genuine sociality, this theory claims that humans have instincts derived from natural selection operating at the individual level, where members of a species selfishly compete for food, shelter, territory and a mate, and instincts derived from natural selection operating at the group level, where, it is claimed, groups of altruistic cooperative members outcompete groups of selfish non-cooperative members, with the supposed selfish individual level instincts being the bad or sinful aspects of our nature, and the selfless, supposed group-selected instincts being the good or virtuous aspect of our nature. According to Wilson, individual selection is responsible for much of what we call sin, while group selection is responsible for the greater part of virtue. Together they have created the conflict between the poorer and the better angels of our nature. In summary, Wilson asserts that the dilemma of good and evil was created by multilevel selection. Before looking at the way in which the multilevel selection theory for eusociality misrepresents, in fact avoids, the real, consciousness-derived psychological aspect of the human condition, we need to look at the group selection mechanism that Wilson says accounts for our moral sense. Because while we certainly do have a genuine moral sense, under scrutiny, Wilson's theory of how we acquired it completely falls apart. While it makes sense that, as Wilson states, groups of altruists will beat groups of selfish individuals, the biological stumbling block is whether genes, which have to selfishly ensure they reproduce if they are to carry on, can develop self-sacrificing altruistic traits in the first place. Indeed, the initial premise of group selection makes so much sense that even Darwin canvassed the idea, but with far less arrogance than Wilson, aware as he was of the inherent difficulties of the concept. With regard to Darwin's tentative approach to group selection, one of the leading evolutionary theorists of the 20th century, William Hamilton, said that Darwin had gone there circumspectly or not at all. I described Darwin's flirtation with group selection in Freedom Expanded at www.humancondition.com/freedom-expanded-multilevel-selection. To reiterate, while it is true that a group of altruists whose members are prepared to make sacrifices for each other will defeat a group whose members are concerned only for themselves, the question is whether a group of altruists can ever actually form in the first place. The genetic reality is that whenever an unconditionally selfless altruistic trait appears, those that are selfish will naturally take advantage of it. Sure, you can help me reproduce my genes, but I'm not about to help you reproduce yours. Any selflessness that might arise through group selection will be constantly exploited by individual selfishness from within the group. As the biologist Jerry Coyne pointed out, group selection for altruism would be unlikely to override the tendency of each group to quickly lose its altruism through natural selection favouring cheaters, selfish individuals. The only biological models that have been presented that appear to overcome this problem of genetic selfishness, always prevailing, are so complex and convoluted they seem highly implausible, in that they involve the disbanding of a population into new, separate colonies formed by solitary, fertilized females, some of whom only have selfish genes and some of whom have altruistic genes, with those altruistic colonies outcompeting those with just selfish genes to build larger, more altruistic populations. Then, before the colonies with altruistic genes quickly lose their altruism through natural selection favouring cheaters, the colonies peacefully merge back into one population, after which fertilised females separate out again to breed new, isolated groups, and so on. Essentially, the model requires a process of constant merging and disbanding in order to outrun the genetic imperative in nature to exploit altruism or selflessness. The situations where this between-group selection of unconditionally selfless traits is said to have taken place are in the occurrence of female-biased sex ratios in some small invertebrate species and in the evolution of reduced virulence in some diseased organisms. However, for large mammals especially, who don't have complex life cycles, the mechanism is so implausible it has to be considered impossible. In his 2012 article, The False Allure of Group Selection, cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker gave this description of the implausibility of group selection. Except in the theoretically possible but empirically unlikely circumstances in which groups bud off new groups faster than their members have babies, any genetic tendency to risk life and limb that results in a net decrease in individual inclusive fitness will be relentlessly selected against. A new mutation with this effect would not come to predominate in the population, and even if it did, it would be driven out by any immigrant or mutant that favoured itself at the expense of the group. Nevertheless, in defiance of the biological reality that even where there is selection between groups, unconditionally selfless traits will be exploited and eliminated. Wilson proposes that extreme warring between groups of early humans where cooperation would have been an advantage was a strong enough force to overcome this problem of selfish exploitation and thus allow for the selection of altruism and the emergence of our genuinely moral instincts. So according to Wilson, our ability to war successfully somehow produced our ability to love unconditionally. Wilson's theory not only defies biological reality, it also flies in the face of both our cultural memories and anthropological evidence. As has been emphasised, standing in stark contrast to Wilson's proclamation of universal and eternal warfare are the cultural memories enshrined in our myths, religions, and in the words of some of our greatest thinkers that attest to humans having a peaceful heritage. Recall, for instance, Plato's description of how our distant ancestors lived a blessed life, where neither was there any violence or devouring of one another, or war or quarrel among them. And in the evidence gleaned from studies in anthropology and primatology, such as the aforementioned recent fossil discoveries that are now confirming a cooperative past, and studies of bonobos, who are our species' closest living relatives and extraordinarily peaceful. But in attempting to prove we have a warlike past, Wilson ignores the evidence provided by the fossil record that reveals at least 7 million years of cooperative existence, and instead argues that to test the prevalence of violent group conflict in deep human history, one can look at archaic cultures such as the Aboriginals of Little Andaman Island off the east coast of India, the Mbuti or Pygmies of Central Africa, and the Kung Bushmen of southern Africa, all today, or at least within historical memory, have exhibited aggressive territorial behaviour. In addition, in his 1978 book on human nature, Wilson wrote of the Bushmen that their homicide rate per capita equaled that of Detroit and Houston. However, there is ample evidence for just how extraordinarily cooperative, social, and relatively peaceful the Bushmen are. For example, Lorna Marshall, regarded as the doyen of American anthropology and one of the only Westerners to live with Bushmen before they became contaminated through contact with more upset, adapted, alienated races, described their predominantly peaceful, well-adjusted human relations. Marshall's daughter, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, who accompanied her on her expeditions in the 1950s, wrote the classic 1959 book about the Bushmen, The Harmless People. In a 1989 edition to that book, Marshall Thomas wrote, "To my knowledge, Wilson has never visited the Jiwasi Bushmen. His book on human nature never mentions how important it was to them to keep their social balance, how carefully they treated this balance, and how successful they were. That he discusses them at all is perhaps due to the fact that in the 1970s they were selected by academics as a sort of living laboratory in which studies could be made on attributes of human nature, the most intriguing of which at the time seemed to be aggression." More will be said in paragraphs 862 to 868 about mechanistic science's misrepresentation of Bushmen and other so-called primitive societies as violent and aggressive in order to comply with the human condition avoiding excuse that we are competitive, aggressive, and selfish because of our animal heritage. Wilson also cites recent archaeological evidence to support the prevalence of violent group conflict in deep human history, stating that early humans had the innate equipment and likely the tendency also to use projectiles in capturing prey and repelling enemies. The advantages gained were surely decisive. Spear points and arrowheads are among the earliest artefacts found in archaeological sites. But this data proves equally unreliable, as the archaeologist Stephen Mithen has noted in 2012. No, the earliest artefacts are from around 2.5 million years ago, but spear points are not made until a mere 250,000 years ago, and arrowheads might have first been manufactured no longer ago than 20,000 years. And in response to Wilson's claim that archaeologists have found burials of massacred people to be a commonplace and archaeological sites are strewn with the evidence of mass conflict, Mithen argues that no, both are quite rare, especially in pre-state societies, and those that are known are difficult to interpret. On primatology, in an attempt to dismiss the example bonobos present of a cooperative, peaceful heritage, Wilson suggests that there is no difference between bonobos and the more aggressive, selfish chimpanzee, claiming, for instance, that like chimpanzees, bonobos do not share the fruit they pick, despite the fact there is a wealth of data recording instances of bonobos sharing fruit, such as a report by Barbara Fruth and Gottfried Hohmann, included in 2002's influential Behavioural Diversity in Chimpanzees and Bonobos, which states, in bonobos, Pan paniscus, food sharing between mature individuals is common, and bonobos often divide large-sized fruits. Wilson also claims bonobos hunt in coordinated packs in the same manner as chimpanzees, wolves and African wild dogs. While bonobos have been known to capture and eat small game, including small monkeys, to supplement their diet with protein, they are not known to routinely hunt down and eat large animals such as colobus monkeys, like chimpanzees do, with hunting behaviour by bonobos very rare. Wilson relies upon a 2008 report by Hohmann titled Primate Hunting by Bonobos at Luikotoli Salonga National Park to draw these erroneous comparisons with the more aggressive chimpanzees. But Hohmann's report actually reveals extraordinary differences between bonobos and chimpanzees, recording that at the Lulungu site, bonobos catch guenons and colobus monkeys, but do not eat them. And at Wamba, bonobos and red colobus monkeys have been seen to engage in mutual grooming. A brief look at the papers Hohmann in turn cites reveals that at Lulungu, the bonobos interacted with the captured primates as if they were dealing with individuals of their own species. They sought cooperation in their interaction with the captured young primates without success. There is no evidence that they ate the captives. This interactional behaviour satisfies the ethological definition of play, and that at Wamba, despite red colobus being major hunting targets of common chimpanzees, there is little evidence of hunting by the pygmy chimpanzees, bonobos, of Wamba, despite the fact that they have been intensively studied for over 10 years. So it turns out that Hohmann's 2008 paper, which Wilson relies so heavily upon to depict bonobos as chimpanzee-like ruthless killers, contains reports of bonobo behaviour that would be unthinkable from a chimpanzee, let alone from wolves or wild dogs, but which Wilson has just ignored. That's one more problem out of the way, he seems to be saying. It would appear that just as the rest of the insecure, human condition-afflicted human race has had to practice the art of denial of the human condition, Wilson too has had to fudge the evidence to try to find support for his lies. In summary, our moral instincts are not derived from warring with other groups of humans, as Wilson and his theory of group selection would have us believe. No. As will be explained in Chapter 5, humans have an unconditionally selfless, fully altruistic, all-loving, universally benevolent, not competitive with other groups, moral conscience. Our instinctive orientation is to love all people, not love some and be at war with others. The savage instincts in us excuse for our selfish behaviour is entirely inconsistent with the fact that we have completely moral, not partially moral and partially savage instincts. Overall then, while the multi-level selection theory for eusociality adds unconditionally selfless instincts to selfish instincts in the mix of what allegedly forms our species' instinctive makeup, thus countering evolutionary psychology's offensive denial of the fact that we have unconditionally selfless instincts, the same old reverse of the truth escape rather than confront the human condition agenda that we have villainous selfish instincts and a blameless conscious mind that has to step in to control them continues. It should be mentioned that there has been an attempt to counter the selfishness emphasizing and justifying biological theories that have been described in this chapter with cooperation, not competition, selflessness, not selfishness emphasizing biological theories. A summary of these left-wing theories, as put forward by scientists such as Stephen Jay Gould, David Sloan Wilson, and Robert Sussman, which all avoid the human condition just as ardently as these right-wing theories, and are therefore just as, if not more, dishonest, false, and unaccountable, is provided in Chapter 6.9, A Brief History of Left-Wing Dishonest Mechanistic Biology. I should also mention here that the real reason for and consequence of genes having to selfishly ensure their own reproduction, which is the genetic reality that all the right-wing and left-wing biological theories have had to accommodate, will be explained when the integration of matter is described later in chapters 4.4 and 4.5. To look now at how Wilson's multi-level selection theory for eusociality avoids the real, consciousness-derived and induced psychological aspect of our human condition. If our instincts are wholly peaceful and cooperative, which they are, and we are not selfish because of selfish instincts, which we are not, what is the source of our selfishness? Or what Wilson calls our propensity for evil? The honest human condition confronting answer is that it is the result of a psychosis. As shown previously, our human behaviour involves our unique, fully conscious thinking mind. As I have emphasised, descriptions of our less than ideal condition, such as egocentric, arrogant, deluded, artificial, hateful, cynical, mean, immoral, alienated, etc., all imply a consciousness-derived psychological dimension to our behaviour. We suffer from a consciousness-induced psychological human condition, not an instinct-controlled animal condition. And so it is to this psychological dimension to our behaviour that we should look for the cause of our selfishness. And yet, in Wilson's psychological problem-avoiding model, our consciousness is merely a mediator between supposed selfish and selfless instincts. As he writes, multilevel selection, group and individual selection combined, also explains the conflicted nature of motivations. Every normal person feels the pull of conscience, of heroism against cowardice, of truth against deception, of commitment against withdrawal. It is our fate to be tormented. We, all of us, live out our lives in conflict and contention. Clever semblance of our conflicted condition, diabolically clever, but entirely untrue. The epitome of schonk, evasion, denial, phoniness, fakeness, separation from the truth, alienation. So, according to Wilson, rather than having an original, completely unconditionally selfless, altruistic, moral, instinctive self or soul, which we then corrupted when we became conscious and developed an upset psychosis, which is the true description of the origin of our condition, we simply have some instincts that want us to behave selflessly and some that don't. While a virtuous, better angels, good part of ourselves exists in Wilson's "we have some selfless instincts" account, there is no guilt from our conscious mind's corruption of our completely selfless moral soul. What this means is that Wilson's account of the human condition is non-judgmental in the sense that there are no real values, no notion of the absolutes of good versus evil or right versus wrong in the true moral sense. What a relief for guilt-stricken humans, but what an incredible fraud. What Wilson has done with his non-psychological, no guilt-stricken conscious mind-involved account is not explain the human condition, but nullify it, render the issue benign, virtually inconsequential, and in doing so, he is effectively burying humanity a long way underground in the deepest, darkest depths of Plato's cave of denial. Make no mistake, Wilson's great phony, fake, superficial, not genuinely biological, Darwin's heir be damned, deliberately human condition trivializing account of the human condition is the most sophisticated expression of denial to have ever been invented, and thus the most dangerous. Certainly, providing humans with a get-out-of-jail-free card, a way to supposedly explain the human condition without having to confront the issue of the extreme psychosis, psych or soul repression, and neurosis, neuron or mental denial, of our real human condition, is immensely appealing to the now overly psychologically upset human race. But it is precisely that seductiveness that is so dangerous. Already school children are talking about the human condition in an offhand way, with the teacher reporting in 2013 that one of her students had remarked that, "I love the term the human condition. I can use it in just about any essay for any subject." This ultimate lie had the potential to seduce the exhausted human race to such a degree that it obliterated any chance of the real human condition ever being truthfully confronted and thus understood. While denial was necessary while we couldn't explain ourselves, taking the art of denial to the extreme that Wilson has done with his dismissal of the fundamental issue before us as a species of our human condition as nothing more than two different instincts within us that are sometimes at odds, is a truly sinister, in fact unconscionable lie. It is the ultimate tragic expression of the human condition avoiding, superficializing, dumbing down, dogma not knowledge preferring, madness becomes universal, end-place situation the human race is now in. The time Plato prophesied where there would be more and more forgetting, dishonest denial to the point where there was a danger of universal ruin to the world. Yes, it is nothing less than the final great push to have the world of lies with all its darkness take over the world and condemn humanity to extinction. If the real psychosis addressing and solving explanation of the human condition that is presented here in this book hadn't emerged, then this ultimate lie would have given humanity's headlong march to ever greater levels of lying denial and its terrible alienating effects, its terminal impetus. I should add that despite Wilson's hateful dismissal of religion as mere group propaganda, as nothing more than an expression of tribalism that is dragging us down, and that, for the sake of human progress, the best thing we could possibly do would be to diminish to the point of eliminating religious faith, the fact is religions resonate with us and have done for millennia because they contain profound truth. Contrast Wilson's dangerously superficial account of our condition, where our consciousness is the blameless mediator or manager of villainous, selfish instincts within us, with Moses' Garden of Eden account of the origin or genesis of the human condition, or Plato's two-horse chariot and reversed cosmos accounts, see chapter 2.6, all of which say that our instinctive heritage is wholly selfless and that it was the emergence of consciousness that led to our selfishness. These are the accounts that acknowledge the problematic role of our conscious mind, which is where the real terror of the human condition lies, our deep insecurity about whether we, our conscious thinking self, is actually evil. And it is these accounts that have been reinforced by some of history's most profound thinkers, like Van der Post, Murray, Koestler, and Berdyaev, whose words were included earlier in paragraphs 186 to 188. It is worth including here a review in a 2013 issue of The Spectator by the journalist Christopher Booker of Wilson's The Social Conquest of Earth. While I don't agree at all with Booker's assertion that Darwin's theory of natural selection is a flawed and deficient theory that can't explain how all of life developed, the explanation of how it can and does is presented in subsequent chapters of this book. In every other respect, what he has to say about Wilson's book is extraordinarily honest. In particular, that what Wilson completely misses out is any recognition of what is by far the most glaring difference between humans and ants. We have broken free from the dictates of instinct. That peculiarity of human consciousness has allowed us to step outside the instinctive frame. But it is this which also gives us our disintegrative propensity, individually and collectively, to behave egocentrically, presenting us with all those problems which distinguish us from all the other species which still live in unthinking obedience to the dictates of nature. All these follow from that split from our selfless, higher nature, with which, over the millennia, our customs, laws, religion, and artistic creativity have tried their best to reintegrate us. Yes, in summary, Wilson continues to look everywhere for the cause of our condition, except to our consciousness, And instead of explaining our psychosis, all those problems which distinguish us from all other species, as Booker referred to it, he simply states that it does not exist. Like most resigned, human condition avoiding humans and other mechanistic scientists, he is effectively saying, what psychosis, what inner insecurity, what sense of guilt, what original golden age of innocence, what split from our selfless higher nature, what fallen condition, what haunted existence dogged by the shadow of our human condition, what deeply troubled state, what depression from the mountains of the mind, cliffs of full, frightful sheer, what agonizing issue of the human condition that we as teenagers had to learn to let it be, what cave-like state of alienated denial that I'm now living in, what phony fake alienated to the roots existence, what great elephant in the living room of our lives that we can't acknowledge, what sickness of the soul, for that matter, what soul, what dreamed of psychologically rehabilitated, transformed human race, what wonderful time when we all live as one that John Lennon imagined. To Wilson, the human condition is nothing more than a conflict between selfless and selfish instincts within us. He is basically saying, to hell with your psychological garbage, I'm not going there. So while he might have won almost every accolade in science, in the end, Wilson has revealed himself to be just another victim of the human condition, coping with it by finding a way to deny it. There is one last but very important aspect of Wilson's account that needs to be addressed, which is that his notion of our condition being a result of selfish and selfless instincts within us would mean that unless we change our genes, we are, as he asserts, intrinsically imperfectible. But such a fate is completely inconsistent with one of the central beliefs about the real psychological nature of our condition, which is that finding understanding of it will bring about the psychologically ameliorated transformation of the human race. If, as Wilson maintains, we don't suffer from a psychosis, then we can't be healed. But we do suffer from a psychosis which can be healed. Carl Jung was forever asserting that wholeness for humans depends on the ability to own their own shadow, because he knew that finding the psychologically ameliorating understanding of the dark side of ourselves would make us whole. In religious terms, the Lord's Prayer contains the hope of the time when the godly, ideal, peaceful kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In contemporary mythology, the same sentiment is conveyed in the words of our modern-day truthful thinking prophets. In John Lennon's imaginings, in Bob Dylan's anticipation of when the ship, understanding the human condition, comes in and the morning will be a-breaking, and the dishonest words that are used to get the ship confused will no longer be understood as their spoken truth, in his 1963 song When the Ship Comes in Jim Morrison's of the Doors' 1968 song Waiting for the Sun, singing of standing there on freedom's shore, waiting for the sun, waiting to tell me what went wrong, waiting for the liberating light of understanding of our upset lives to arrive, because, as he sings in his 1966 song, Break On Through, when day destroys night, we can break on through to the other side, to our freedom from the agony of the human condition. And finally, in Bono's of the band U2 lyrics about the coming of a world high on a uncorrupted desert plain, where there will be no more egocentricity, and the streets will have no name, and there will be no toil or sorrow, then there will be no time of pain, in his 1987 song Where the Streets Have No Name. This last prophetic vision is exactly the same as that expressed in the Bible, where it states that another denial-free, honest, all-clarifying book will be opened, which is the book of life, which will introduce a new heaven and a new earth. And wipe every tear from our eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Buddhist scripture contains the exact same anticipation of a fabulous time when humans will, with a perfect voice, preach the true Dharma, present the supreme wisdom, namely the psychologically rehabilitating, transforming, true understanding of the human condition, which is auspicious and removes all ill, saying, human beings are then without any blemishes, moral offences are unknown among them, and they are full of zest and joy. Yes, the fulfilment of Holden Caulfield's dream of a time when the need for resignation, with all its horrible, alienating, psychosis and neurosis-producing effects that Francis Bacon so honestly depicted, will end, is what the human race has tirelessly been working towards, and has now, in the nick of time, finally achieved. We are precisely the opposite of what Wilson argues, because we are in fact intrinsically perfectible.